The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, you know, the mega corporation that's demanding yet another $1.1 billion bailout from taxpayers this year, just like they demanded a $1.1 billion bailout from us last year. Well, they've panicked. For weeks, they've been sweating about today's parliamentary investigation into their bad behavior, including their violation of Canada's Access to Information Law. That's an important law designed to allow taxpayers to scrutinize how government agencies spend tax money and conduct their business. It's a basic tool of accountability in a democracy, but as you can imagine, any mega corporation that bleeds $1.1 billion a year in red ink, but still parties like Donald Trump with lavish travel and entertainment expenses, well, they don't like accountability too much. Now, we at The Sun have made inquiries using that Access to Information Act, but the CBC has refused to answer them, claiming that how much they spend on things like booze and limos is somehow a state secret, like protecting a journalistic source. Here's our president, Pierre-Karl Péladeau, in Parliament today, pointing out just how laughable that excuse is.
Not a single one of the numerous access to information requests we sent to CBC Radio-Canada was aimed at journalistic sources. In fact, not only have we never made such demand, but we never would. Furthermore,
look, any mega corporation like the CBC that gets a $1.1 billion a year bailout should be subject to scrutiny. It's just a building block of democracy. Again, here's our boss, Pierre-Karl Péladeau, making that point today before Parliament.
As the Crown Corporation received the largest subsidy from the Canadian Parliament, CBC Radio-Canada cannot be immune from public scrutiny.
It's not just journalists like me and businessmen like Péladeau who are upset with the CBC's high-handedness. Parliament's non-partisan information commissioner, Suzanne Legault, has given the CBC an F in her report card for their lack of compliance with this law. She ordered the CBC to answer questions about their wasting our money. But the CBC refused and spent millions appealing her rulings to a court. Here's the CBC's boss, Hubert Lacroix, telling Parliament he wanted another $1.1 billion from taxpayers, but there was no way in hell he was going to answer for how he spends it.
We believe that only a judge should have the right to demand the disclosure of information that relates to our creative activities or is journalistic or program related.
Yeah, well, guess what? The CBC lost before that judge. They were ordered to explain what they were wasting our tax money on, but the CBC still refused. Now they're spending millions more to stop us from finding out where the last few billion went to. That's the kind of thing that Parliament was investigating today, that disrespect for taxpayers and for Parliament, and for Parliament's access to information laws that bind all government agencies. Now, not all Canadian media have been reporting on this story. You'd think they would. I mean, asking for a $1.1 billion bailout every year and hiding how you spend it. I mean, think about how much scrutiny the $2 billion wasted on the gun registry got, but that was over 15 years. Or $250 million burned up in ad scam. But funny enough, most media have been silent about the CBC's $1.1 billion a year. Of course, the CBC itself isn't going to do a story on its own wastefulness or secrecy. But what about, say, my friends at the National Post and their sister newspapers like the Ottawa Citizen? Or how about a large news agency called the Canadian Press, or CP for short? Well, you see, that's the problem. The CBC has sloshed around enough of its $1.1 billion in annual bailout money to other reporters to co-opt them. Here's the boss saying that today in Parliament.
Today, the National Post is in a commercial partnership with the CBC, whereby the CBC provided with essential sports and video content. It is no surprise that CBC Watch is gone. It has been replaced with stories promoting new CBC programming and giveaways of episodes of The Nature of Things to people who sign up their mobile app.
So that takes care of the National Post. The CBC is the biggest customer for Canadian Press stories. So how likely is it that CP would criticize its biggest customer? Pretty low. National Post and its sister paper in 2009, as PKP said in Parliament today, they signed a multi-million-dollar deal with the CBC to share editorial content and ads. That's about when they stopped criticizing CBC wastefulness. And it makes sense that the Post has been having a tough time of it financially. If it's between reporting on a $1.1 billion scandal or going bankrupt or biting their tongue and getting some of that $1.1 billion themselves, what do you think they chose? And it's not just that. Even though every Canadian with a TV set is forced to get CBC on their cable package by law and to pay for it each month, the CBC still sloshes some of their bailout money around to advertise the CBC. I'm not sure why. I mean, they're already on your TV. You're forced to pay for the CBC every month, plus pay for their bailout. The only way this advertising money makes sense, again, is to buy off critics or punish them. And that's why, for example, the CBC never advertises in the Sun newspapers with Quebecor, because we're offside with them. It is their way of rewarding friends and punishing us. Anyways, you already know all that. You already know how they use anti-competitive behavior to buy exclusive broadcast rights for public events like the Canada Day celebrations on Parliament Hill and then banning private competitors like us from showing it. That's just one example. But anyways, all of this was coming to a head today when Parliament was going to turn over some rocks and see what was going to go scurrying. That's when our boss, Pierre-Karl Péladeau, was there. And so last night, on the eve of this parliamentary inquiry, the CBC panicked. And they dropped their mask for a moment. And they showed that what we suspected all along was true. The CBC proved they're not a group of reporters. They're not a news agency. They're not a public broadcaster. They are a political entity of their own with an agenda of their own. Here's what I mean. Last night, the CBC used part of their $1.1 billion bailout that was supposed to go to journalism. No, it didn't. It went to launch a crazy personal attack on our president, Pierre-Karl Péladeau, one of Canada's most successful private sector media entrepreneurs. Now, unlike the CBC, Péladeau actually built this company up, honestly, with his own efforts. He took a newspaper company started by his father, Pierre Péladeau, and he turned it into Quebec's most successful media company called Quebecor. And then he added on English Canada's most successful newspaper company, The Sun. And then he built the Sun News Network, all without a $1.1 billion a year grant from the government. And you know, guess what? Quebecor's TV channels in Quebec crush the CBC in ratings. Oh, the CBC hates that. Anyways, last night, on the eve of Péladeau's testimony to Parliament, the CBC they freaked out. In an absolutely unprecedented move, they issued what can only be called an attack ad against Quebecor and the Sun and Péladeau. It wasn't a news story, I don't think. I don't know quite what it was, but it was a false and defamatory attack on our company as vengeance for our questions about how they spend taxpayers' money. Look, if any other government agency had done this, whoever was responsible would have been fired immediately. It wasn't just unprofessional. It wasn't just outside of their mandate or what they're given their bailout money for. It was an attempt to destroy a private sector company that they hate. Now, if that had been done by any government agency, there would be resignations demanded. That's against the law. Take, for example, if Canada Post, another government agency with monopoly powers, had raised the price of a postage stamp by a couple of cents and then used that money to launch a blistering attack on its private sector competitor, UPS. I mean, it's just unthinkable. I mean, if they had taken advantage of their government power and their forced monopoly and used public money, and instead of using it to deliver the mail, used it to fight a private vendetta against a rival who does a better job than they do, heads would roll. Let's take a look at that CBC attack brochure. Here it is on the CBC webpage. Now, you notice the first thing, they don't say who wrote this. Was it one of their journalists? They say not. Well, I don't know who it was. Was it a political campaign professional working within the CBC? I don't know. Was it Hubert Lacroix himself? The CBC says senior management wrote it. Oh, I bet they did. How much money did they spend of their budget to put together this attack ad? They didn't tell me when I asked. I asked Jeff Kay, the CBC spokesman, about these things. He refused to come on the show today. But look at the headline. Look at this. Here's another part of their attack brochure. Look at their headline. It's called What Quebecor Won't Tell You About Its Attacks on the Public Broadcaster. Okay, do you get that? We're asking about where $1.1 billion in bailout money went year after year. But they're calling that question an attack. So us asking why the CBC is breaking access to information laws is an attack. So taxpayers have no place in a CBC world. Asking for government accountability is simply an attack in their world. Just like when the CBC threw their $1 million party at the film festival last month, taxpayers were not invited. They were told to keep behind police-style riot gates. Taxpayers only have one role to the CBC: to pay for things and then shut up. But instead of defending against these so-called attacks, instead of explaining what they blow our $1.1 billion a year on, instead of explaining why they got an F from the Nonpartisan Information Commissioner, the CBC decided to attack Quebecor, a private company that owns the Sun, on completely irrelevant grounds. Now, that would be like someone asking a politician why he blew, $250 million on ad scam, and the politician replying, hey, well, I'm not answering you because you're fat and ugly. That would be a personal attack. It's ad hominem. It's a distraction. It's not the answer to the real question. It shows just how unhinged and scared the CBC brass are. They'll do anything to change the channel, to change the subject. Imagine, just for comparison, if one of the banks that Obama bailed out in the States with tax money took $1 million of that bailout money and spent it in attack ads going against, taxpayer advocates or newspapers who were asking where the money went. I mean, it's unthinkable. It's insane. But that's what the CBC is doing with their bailout money here. The CBC has not answered or rebutted any of our questions about accountability. They pretty much admit they're secretive and just looking, just looking at their lavish parties. They pretty much confess that why they're secretive. They're partying like it's 1999 over there at the CBC. So they've gone on this bizarre attack, accusing Quebecor, or our company, of being on the government dole too. What? Seriously, if you notice on that first page, the CBC claims that we at the Sun and Quebecor have received, quote, more than $500 million from the government in the past 3 years. I'm sorry, that, my friends, is a lie. It is a lie. Even the CBC's reporters, like our friend Steve Faggy, the blogger, couldn't keep a straight face when they read this. Here's him on Twitter yesterday. He pointed out that the vast majority of that number that the CBC claims is what Quebecor saved in a public auction when Quebecor bought a cell phone license from the government in Quebec. But here's the truth. Here's Pierre Pelledeau talking about it today in Parliament.
In fact, we were the company in Canada that fought for competition in the wireless business. And today, Canadians have access to the best technology at the lowest price. I mean, there were no subsidy at all. In fact, we paid $555 million to buy the spectrum.
Did you get that? Quebecor paid the government $555 million in an auction to buy a cell phone license. But the CBC calls that a subsidy. The CBC thinks the price should have been higher, so they just make it up. They just claim that's some sort of subsidy. Seriously, they just cook it up out of thin air. It was a public auction, independently managed. It involved Quebecor paying money to the government. But the CBC thinks they should have paid more, even though the Quebec payment was highest. It was the largest bid of any of the new cell phone companies. It was higher than the average amount paid by any cell phone companies, either the new ones or the old monopolies. I mean, this part of the CBC's attack is so stupid that even the CBC's most dedicated friends like Steve Faggy are just laughing at them. Only the CBC would think that paying $550 million to the government, which Quebecor did, is a subsidy from the government. Look, we shouldn't be too tough on the CBC. They have never contributed anything to the government's accounts in their 75-year history, so I don't think understand that money sometimes flows from businesses to government, not just the other way around. Here's Steve Faggy also pointing out that the rest of the CBC's made-up number is not a government bailout, like the CBC's annual $1.1 billion, or like the CBC's monthly forced cable fees. It's mainly from TV production funds. Now, it is true that Quebecor gets money from TV production funds to produce shows. I mean, take the Canada Media Fund. Last year, Quebecor did, in fact, receive $20.8 million from that fund. It's the truth. And it's also the truth that Quebecor paid in $21.5 million into the same fund. Quebecor paid more into the fund than took out. Some subsidy, eh? The CBC forgot to mention that part. We actually put more dough in than we took out, something the CBC knows nothing about. By contrast, the CBC took $95 million from that same fund, on top of the $1.1 billion bailout they got, on top of their forced subscription fees. Look, Quebecor has called for the abolition of this fund, by the way, and promised to spend our own money producing TV shows. I hope that happens. So does Pierre-Carl Pelledeau. Like I say, the CBC isn't trustworthy. Their attack ad is failing. They're desperate because they're greedy. They're worried about losing their $1.1 billion subsidy. They're panicking. They've never been held to account before. They're lashing out. And they're lying. Hey, wouldn't you lie for $1.1 billion too? The CBC uploaded a 6-page negative ad brochure to their campaign website. I'm calling it a campaign website because that's what it is, a war against their private sector competitors, except that unlike real political campaigns, they're using your money to do it. I've already dealt with the substance of the CBC accusations. They're lies. But what's more interesting is the logic of the CBC argument here. Let's look at the first 2 pages of their campaign brochure for that. You'll notice the first page is dated October 5th, but they chose to wait to release it on the eve of the parliamentary hearings to distract from Pierre-Carl Pelledeau's testimony. But look at the title here, Examining Quebecor Media's Free Market Message. Again, the CBC is not defending their own illegal and wasteful behavior. They're trying to attack Quebecor for being on the public teat like they are. Look at page 2. Again, no attempt to answer for their abuse of tax money, just a weird attack on us claiming that we take public benefits. This actually explains a lot, though. It proves my point. They think they can diffuse criticism or buy off their critics with government money. They believe that the best way to get people off their backs is to get them in the trough too, to shovel money at critics, because as the CBC has proved with Canadian Press or the National Post or even individual reporters like Jennifer Dishburn, who gets paid every single time they appear on the CBC, if you pay people off with a few thousand or a few $1 million, you take away their credibility to criticize the CBC's billions. That's their only arguments, their only ammo. If everyone is on the take, then no one can blow the whistle. So they're desperately trying to prove we're on the take too, just like them, so that our criticisms about their wastefulness can be ignored. There's a phrase for this in logic. It's a Latin phrase. I've been practicing it all morning. Tu quoque. That's Latin for meaning, hey, you did it too. Tu quoque. You did it too. That's the CBC's only argument, but it's just not true. We didn't do it too. We pay our way here at Quebecor and at the Sun News Network. We don't take $1.1 billion from the taxpayers in a bailout each year. We actually paid $555 million to the taxpayers to buy a cell phone license, the highest anyone paid at the last auction for new cell phone companies. We pay more into the Canadian Media Fund than we take out. And unlike the CBC, we actually want to get rid of these stupid industry funds. I am disgusted by this false attack by the CBC. I'm sure it's illegal. It's not permitted by the CBC's mandate. It was not contemplated in the CBC's annual bailout payment by Parliament. It's just as illegal as when the CBC hides its use of tax money for luxurious travel or boozy parties. And just like those expenditures, I am sure they'll refuse to disclose just how much they spent on this attack campaign. But you know what? It doesn't matter, because we know the truth anyways. The CBC is no longer a journalistic organization. It is an attack organization, a predator, getting even, getting personal with its private competitors. They hate me, but the hate for me is just a drop of their hatred for Pierre-Carl Pelledeau. The CBC no longer even pretends to be about reporting. Now it's just battling for its own fat paycheck. They don't even try to justify their waste or secrecy. They just try to say, hey, everybody does it. Well, I'm here to say no. We're not all on the government teat. The National Post was bought off, Canadian Press was bought off, but not us. We are the last independent voice of journalism in Canada. And when we ask questions about $1.1 billion in annual bailouts for the CBC, it's not because we're in a competitive war with the CBC. It's because asking about taxpayers' money is real journalism in the public interest, something they know precious little about over there at the government bunker.